Um, uh, as Mr. Rinaldi said, I was at the grassroots of everything that happened in APPR, and in curriculum and assessment and shifting the state testing to online and doing all of those pieces. And then I had the privilege of then being able to be in a district and not only be able to oversee the implementation of things at the district, but also be audited by New York State on virtually everything we did. So we had an APPR audit, we have had a special ed audit, you name it, we've had an audit. The district was a district in need of improvement for several years. So being able to work within the context that you guys will see as leaders from the ground up, both being able to see it across 27 component districts as well as in a larger small city school district has been very eye-opening. Has made me really be able to think a lot about some of the things that we're going to talk about today, especially culture, and looking at your capstone project, which I told Mr. Rinaldi is incredibly thorough. You will gain a lot from that, and you'll be able to use that work from what you have there on job interviews, in your actual practice. I encourage you to really ask the hard questions that you're going to have to ask in order to complete it, but then save that document somewhere as a reference point when you do interviews, when you create entry plans, and when you're actually in a position, because it's really, really well done. I was very impressed.
Well, thank you for that, Teresa. Teresa, would you agree that the curriculum, there's no common practical definition in practice of what a curriculum is? So when you ask for curriculum, you kind of get all kinds of things. Is that true in your experience?
It's more than true. For a while we had the phase where everyone was creating a curriculum map. And so people had a common language, if you will, but they didn't have a common understanding of what that is. So when we say curriculum, people vaguely know what it is, but there's not really a deep understanding of it. And it's so individualized in each of the districts. You may have an incredibly robust curriculum map that gets detailed down to individual lessons. You might have just a generic framework and roadmap. Most people in my experience, though, when you ask, and don't be surprised by this, when they say, what's your curriculum, are going to show you the textbook. Yeah. Textbook's not a curriculum, that's a curriculum resource. But, particularly as you get up into the secondary level, that becomes the curriculum. And, I was always taught, and I've always tried to help folks understand, there's the written curriculum, that document that people have that very often gets put on a shelf or it's housed electronically. Then there's your taught curriculum, what actually happens inside those individual classrooms. And then there's the tested curriculum. So when you're familiar with state assessments, which seem to drive everyone, whether you're in New York State or the Carolinas, we tend to teach to the test, and that becomes the curriculum by default. And so really the job of a school leader at any level is to figure those three out and make sure that what we're doing for kids is continuous and is going to help them once they leave school. But I agree with you 100%. We have a common understanding of the word, but not a common definition and working agreement of what it looks like.
Teresa, where do you find the biggest breakdown in terms of vertical alignment? Does anything stand out to you?
Yes, wherever your district transitions buildings. Yes. So if you have a K-5 elementary and then a 6-8 middle school, typically there's very few conversations that happen, middle school. We try to work on that a lot because developmentally that's where kids are. And then again, from 8th grade, then moving up to the high school. But anytime you have a break in a building, it's usually bigger. And that usually ends up showing in the assessments. That's usually the best way to know that it happens. But we try to get better at that, I think, and have more of those conversations across buildings, but it seems to fall. The second place I find it is wherever you have a break in your curriculum resources. So prime example for those of you who use or are familiar with what's happening, and I think, Nick, you said you were using Amplify. Did I have that right? No,
No, that was
Matt,
the only other guy
Matt,
in the class.
Matt, you said that. So if you only implement Amplify at your middle school level, or you include fifth grade because you wanted some continuity, wherever you break your curriculum resources are also typically where you have a break in your continuity, because folks tend to rely on that curriculum resource as the curriculum. So with New York State, they put in place a K2 domains, right? So folks were using that, and then a different group did 3 through 8, and then a different group did 9 through 12. And so there was not, on the face of it, the documents didn't look the same. The language that was used wasn't the same. It was easy from a 5,000-foot view to see how things scaffolded and built. But because everything wasn't in exactly the same language, people viewed it as different, and we see bigger breaks in third grade. And then again in ninth grade as the kids are transitioning, because the teachers tend not to know the language of the previous year. It's most obvious in math. I don't think we had anybody teaching math, but it's painfully obvious in math, and how they approach the language of mathematics and how they approach problem solving, simply because the curriculum ended up being built off the resource, and wherever there was a break in that resource, there was a break in the continuity.
Teresa, what is it that a superintendent can do to facilitate better horizontal alignment? What would you like to, you're very opinionated. What would you like to see what would you like to see superintendents do to fix that?
Well, since you phrase it that way, I would like to see superintendents ensure that there's common planning time. And I mean adequate common planning time, not 15 minutes here or there, not that 20 minutes after school kind of piece. You have to be able to allow for not only the horizontal conversations, right, but the vertical conversations. I came most recently from a district that had 4 elementary buildings and 2 teachers at every grade level. So I often ask the teachers, if I had twins and I had them in one 4th grade in one building and another 4th grade in another, when they move to 5th grade, what's the level of confidence you have that both of those kids, thinking their ability is equal, would have received the same education and have the same outcome skills going into 5th grade? And then what's your confidence level those kids going into the middle school would have? That's, the horizontal piece of it if you've got the hypothetical twins. So common planning time, the ability to have the time to look at lessons together, make sure that you're staying on pace using assessment data. But the other thing that superintendents really need to be able to do is find that time to give their building principals the ability to have proximity to those classrooms, not just be there when they're doing their evaluations, but be in the classrooms, asking the kids, what are you learning? And being able to see what the kids' perspective of it is. And every teacher has a very different style. Every teacher has a very different way of engaging students, but the kids should be still getting a similar kind of content and being assessed in the same way, so that we can ensure that they've got it, because our kids aren't widgets the same way our teachers aren't widgets. And our principals need to have that freedom to not be pulled out to a million central office meetings, to have to put out a ton of fires, and be able to do that. And one of the ways that I tried to do that was to every day be in a building and make sure that I was able to spell a teacher if a teacher needed to go and have that grade level meeting, or be able to ask those kids the questions as well. So it's really time, which is probably the most precious resource that we don't have when we talk about education.
Thank you. Good example of leadership, right? Just taking the initiative to make sure that you got those key people together. I'm a small school superintendent, but I was oftentimes disappointed in my experience by principals who were not inclined to bridge the gap between the buildings. Now, of course, having been a principal, I know there's a legitimate reason for that. You're so darn busy with your own building. The notion of trying to build a bridge to another building can be daunting. And, why take on another task? So I'm going to bet that in your experience, once you all become superintendents as central office individuals, that you're going to have to actually step up and force that conversation. Otherwise, the likelihood of it happening is diminished. Exaggeration, Teresa, you've certainly seen more than I've seen.
Well, I think it's also not just making sure that you force them out into that, but it's also providing. Here's the reality: the further in administration you get, the less likely you are to admit you don't know something, right? Leaders think their credibility depends on what they know and how well they can say it and have you believe them. But if what you say and what you do don't match, everybody knows it, right down to the kid level. So the other thing that has to happen in a central office role is providing a safe place for your leaders and your teachers to acknowledge when they don't know something, and then provide that professional development to get to know it. And the standards and assessments, particularly with all the waves of changes that we've had, are that one area. You know, sometimes you have to step up and admit, I don't really know what a learning target looks like. And I have no idea why you're asking me to provide a learning target every damn day, and why you're giving me feedback on this, particularly if the feedback's not really growth producing. It's really obvious in the feedback if they don't know it. So you have to remember to be humble enough to say, I still have to learn it and I don't know, and ask help, and then take advantage of that help. But that's a tough nut to crack. But it is something that's absolutely critical that you've got to make sure that foundation's there for.
Anyways, I'm off on a tangent.
Linda Darling Hammond is never wanted them to be linked. She was in favor of assessments, but she never wanted them to be linked to teacher evaluation because, particularly in New York State, 3 through 5 assessments never were high stakes for students. They became high stakes for teachers once we linked them to evaluation, and that everything just completely blew up when then. And I would posit that the predictability from grade level to grade level is even lower than what you said, and it's even lower now that we've moved to a computer-based testing platform. Particularly the computer-based testing platform we have now, that really is just taking the test on computer. There's no computer enhancement of it. So there's no value add to take on the computer other than ease of scoring, frankly. So I think it's even less reliable.
True.
So this particular triangle really has to go with making sure that, and I use the word learning targets. Can a quick show of hands? Are you asked to use learning targets in your district? Are you familiar with learning targets? Right, they've kind of become the new buzzword around town. And so a quick way to walk into a classroom as a leader is to take a look and see if the learning targets are posted somewhere, because they're supposed to provide the direction for the students of the learning that day. And then when you see the learning targets, you should be able to observe the learning activities in the classroom, how the students are going to get to that, and then what the teacher is going to assess the students on should align to the learning targets. But in the center of all of that should be the standard. So if I walk into a classroom and I see a learning target that says, today we will, I can create a basket underwater. I know there's no New York State standard or any standard anywhere that has anything to do with that, right? So my favorite one example to use with teachers is I can play mum ball, right? Mum ball's not a standard. So when you walk in and you see mum ball and you're in a classroom for 20 minutes and I'm observing mum ball, there's a problem. There's nothing happening. And so what you're really doing is looking to see, have we carved the path for the kiddos by the learning target being posted and had conversation about it? Are the activities lending themselves so the students can meet that learning target? And is the teacher formally or informally assessing the students on whether or not they met that learning target? And I should be able to ask the teacher then what standard is grounded back in. And then when I have that congruency is when I've hit that bright spot in the classroom.
Now,
or school psychologists who want to go into leadership get hit by teachers for having a lack of credibility. How can they come in and evaluate my class? They never had to teach it. Or an elementary teacher moving to a middle school or secondary leadership position, they don't know what it's like. And I think that's where so much of the ability to move the district to alignment and to congruence in the classroom comes from building the relationship, that you're not putting yourself out there as the expert. But I had no problem walking into the chemistry class and saying, hey, I am not an expert on chemistry. So can you tell me, like, what's the vocab that you want your kids to be able to master by the end of this lesson? What should I be listening for? What should I be looking for the kids to be able to do? And having that conversation, because the reality is the teacher's the expert of what's happening in that classroom, and they're going to know the kids most intimately and why they've made those choices. You're just there to ask those questions, again, from that 5,000-foot view, to make sure that everybody's on the same page and find those gaps either in knowledge or skills of the teacher or the administrator that you need to bring in to be able to bridge that gap, so that you have, again, that common vocabulary, but also the common understanding of that vocabulary. So the more you can practice questioning now and asking those questions and being sincere when you ask them, I think the better off you'll be, because you're just going to be comfortable asking it and admitting, hey, I don't know chemistry. Help me out. What do you want kids to know so I can look for it for you?
Excellent point.
We're all incredibly well-meaning when we supplement the instruction, but another part of that is an equity issue. You know, if the supplemental resources are not aligned, but they're also not consistent across the district, you start to create a real equity issue inside of that. And that's something that, particularly when you, again, have multiple, my folks from New York City, my folks from Buffalo Public Schools, you know, when you have multiple schools, if you don't have those same or similar resources there, the disparity of what the kids are able to do and do with it. And it's not even just the resources, it's the time. If one building has common planning time and another doesn't. So you really need to think about those things in terms of that continuity and the congruence piece of it.
Thank you.
When I came into the district, we didn't have a review cycle. So basically what happened was whoever said, hey, so each district in New York State has a pool of textbook aid. And if you become really good friends with your business official, which I highly recommend, they will let you know how much money you have in there, and they want that spent, right? So one of the things that was happening is whoever screamed the loudest tended to get the most updated curriculum materials. And by the way, I'm scanning my list real quick. Megan, as a music teacher, yes, we included sheet music on that because I learned the sparsity of sheet music quickly. And so we built in sheet music into our curriculum cycle along with the rest of it. But one of the things that you want to do is set up that cycle so that follows where the state is with the standards. So science, we actually put in place 2 years ago. We started the researching and the piloting of science materials, knowing when the next generation science standards were going to kick in, and we wanted to have everybody set up for it, knowing when the new tests were going to hit. And so you need to have those sort of align with what's happening. Same thing with the social studies frameworks. Start getting those curricular resources and spending those pieces, and that's where having that review cycle and then having a curriculum council who sort of led the way to be able to do that work, who could say, what is it that we want? Who would go back and survey their buildings, because we had representatives from each building. We included special education teachers. We included our instructional support specialists so that we could really, when we looked for curriculum resources, we covered everything that we needed, supplemental as well as core instruction, and then met on a regular basis for anything that came up. What are you hearing? What's the data look like? What are the formative assessments looking like? And giving us those things so that we knew they were being used. And it just takes a lot of time to build those and a lot of time to follow through. Like, I led the ELA Curriculum Council, and it was near and dear to my heart. But boy, howdy, it got real hard after a while to maintain those half-day meetings 4 times a year. But I had to put them on my schedule and not move and not do anything around them, because it was so important to have those meetings and hear back from what happened to it. And so sometimes you have to build them if they're not already in place. And a lot of the times, the folks who are going to come to the forefront at the beginning are the ones who mistrust the system, right? And that's great to have. You want to have them too, because they're the people who, once they trust the system, are going to be able to go back and say, okay, she's really going to put her money where her mouth is, and she walks the walk and talks the talk. So you have to make sure that you have the people who are sometimes perceived as negative, as well as the people who are going to be amenable to anything, because that's the only way you're going to get that system to move. So you really kind of get a sense of that culture, laid back. And that's, again, why that survey is so critical, and similar questions you want to ask in your entry into any district, so that you get a sense of what it's like and where you can build from, and where the most important step to start building would be.
Teresa, would you recommend that this is where a principal or assistant superintendent for curriculum instruction, or even a small school super, ought to go?
Well, I think it's an important document in terms of the fact that if you work backwards, you need to understand, because the shifts in the assessment are the most significant shifts that are happening, whether you're talking ELA and math, which is what Mr. Rinaldi is showing you here, the science standards, or the social studies framework, which is spoken about first. That shift in assessment is the biggest shift. The ELA and math standards themselves did not differ significantly. There's a lot of new definitions that are in place. There's a new focus on play and on K1-2, which was very much needed in ELA. But in terms of looking at the standards themselves, they tried to make them fewer. And we lost a little bit of the essence that we had before. The spirals maybe not as easy to see, but you should always work backwards from this, because that's when the rubber hits the road, right? So you need to know when that assessment's changing in terms of how much time you have, because the other reality once you see this is, where's your staff now? So if you were to ask your teachers their knowledge of the New York State standards, or whatever state you're in, that's going to determine really what your internal timeline is going to look at, like knowing where the state assessment is. Because if your teachers really were not showing fidelity to standards, if your curriculum documents were not showing alignment to the standards, you didn't already have horizontal and vertical, you have to start fresh. Right? So you have to start back at the beginning in terms of looking at the standards, understanding the standards documents, internally how they go from pre-K through 12, the purpose of the standards, the language of the standards, and work from a different place than a district that already has these documents in place and now really needs to take a look and say, okay, so where are the standards changing? And then where do I need to change what we do here in the district? So I always recommend when you get these, you take a look at the end, because the state assessment is the end. I have to be honest with you, I'm not sure that they're not going to maybe revise this a little bit, given that we didn't have state assessments this year. And I know for a fact Regents exams are still in the can. So that's kind of where we are with that. You know, the Pearson contract is up. They've got to get a new vendor for state assessment. So all of those kind of skew the timeline, but you should look at where the end date is. But then you have to look at exactly where you are, because your middle may look entirely different. These documents are different than we've had in New York State in the past, because New York State worked with a group, an organization called the Staff and Curriculum Development Network, which was made up of the Big Five school representatives as well as representatives from the BOCES, to decide how could the state work with the BOCES and the Big Five to roll out documents to help and PD to help understand what these look like. So that's kind of why these are there. They're benchmarks for those organizations to help you with those documents. And I'm sure once you explore the site more, if you haven't seen it already, you're going to see some of those very critical documents, and they're very powerful. I've used some of the ELA ones in terms of really being able to narrow down that focus and what is it that we're looking for to help you identify those power standards, because they're going to shift a little bit.
So
SED from a communication perspective, and again, this was created with the input of SEDN and the BOCES, as well as that standards task force. Communication has not always been stellar from SED. And one of the things that, because I was still in the conversation at the time, one of the big pushes was each district really is supposed to still be doing some strategic action planning, whether you're calling it a CDEP, whether you're calling it a strategic plan document like I did in Dunkirk. And each district should have some sort of document like this. And so the push was for SED to model the approach districts should be taking, so that in reality, exactly as was just spoken about, you would make this editable document your own, because it also, your stakeholder groups then might change, and you might have then the district, the building, parents and families. Do you know what I mean? So you would start to think about what it's going to look like so that you have that continuity. And they really did a great job of modeling what the document should look like. So as you're asking questions and digging in your district, is there a broader district document that looks something like this about the importance of teaching and learning inside your district? That's another thing to be looking for, because this is the type of document you'd want to create.
Excellent. Teresa, would you give us a commentary? What is the status right now? Since I've left in 14, I've lost track. What's the status of the modules and the curriculum as they're looking at they're exploring those?
So I'm just double checking. I can't remember if the updated curriculum, the next gen curriculum, is up there or not. But the curriculum documents are up there. There's some overview documents. The biggest piece that we have been stressing everyone to do is read the introduction, because that gives the vision for how the document was created, gives some definitions. The math definitions have become quite the conversation piece. So those of you who've had to do math might want to check that out. But the Engage New York modules will not be updated to reflect the new standards, numbers, letters, etc. They're going to still be up there as a resource. As I said, they're fairly minor changes across ELA and math. So I don't think that anyone would have to necessarily veer off of those documents, off of that curricular resource, if they didn't want to. But they're not going to update the modules that are there. And so many districts had already adapted those modules for their own setting. You know, I know we had swapped out some of the books to be a little bit more appropriate to the culture of our district. And added some additional resources. You have that flexibility to do it. And so again, that's part of the work of looking at the standards, going back to your curriculum, making sure your curriculum aligns, and then making sure your curriculum resources align as well. But it's really important, don't gloss over the overview or introduction documents, because they really are, they're pretty important in terms of understanding how they're laid out.
I remember when I left in 14, there was a large discussion still going on about whether or not you adapt or adopt the modules. Teresa, am I bringing up bad memories?
Yes. Well, truth be told, first of all, folks, I would, so Mr. Rinaldi changed the how I ran those meetings, being a superintendent in the room. I think he was one of two, maybe a third one showed up occasionally. I would not have said, go read it. I would have forced them to read it, and I would have forced them to have engaged in a protocol that would have modeled how you would take it back to your district and lead your leaders in the same way, because it's really important to me to model. But what he's talking about is there was a big, I'm sure, gosh, I look at you though, and you're also darn young. There was a big hue and cry when the modules first came out that the state was forcing curriculum, a standardized, regimented curriculum down people's throats. And we actually, I'm not kidding you, had some teachers who stood in front of their classrooms with the module printed out, and they had it up like this in a notebook, right? Because you had to print everything, and they literally were reading from it. And they said, you gave us a scripted curriculum. And I would just shake my head, because if you've looked at any textbook, it is also scripted. It's giving you the chapters. It's got a little side thing that says, do this in this order, right? That's part of what you've purchased. You've purchased an instructional program, really. So it really was no different from a textbook, except that you had to print them. And there were lots of mistakes, let's be honest. It was done very quickly. There were lots of print errors and mistakes in it. But the conversation was whether you adapt it or you adopt it. And the reality that nobody was really trying to understand was, you always adopt a curriculum. You have to go through a formal adoption process through your Board of Education, particularly when you're spending district funds and you're making a move like this. It's good practice to have something be adopted, but then you're always going to adapt it. The trick is, Do you allow teachers to close their individual doors and adapt it individually, or do you have that conversation as the district so that you can continue to ensure that there's alignment? Because you have to make a positive presupposition that your curriculum resource is aligned, at least internally. It may not be aligned to the standards, but it's aligned internally. But then you want to make your adaptations to the kiddos sitting in front of you, the cultures of your district, the values of your district, your technology integration. You need to do those together and collaboratively, not individually behind closed teacher doors.
All right. So, Teresa, any updates on APPR at 658?
No, not really, because basically everyone's going to have to renegotiate now, depending on when your plan reopens, as they start to unlink things and try to reverse some of the damage that was done on that one. From a compliance aspect of it, I know, having gone through the audit, our practice did not match our approved plan, and that's one of the things that they found, and we had to write an action plan and work to bring those a little bit closer in terms of alignment with our student learning objectives, with the way that we were doing observations, and how we were actually using the rubric. So it'll be interesting to see. Even part of that got put on pause for us, as the lawyers are still working through what the next iteration of this is going to be. So it will be interesting to see, because, evaluations were kind of also placed on hold with the pandemic, and then remote teaching, and you didn't have time to get everybody's evaluations done. The window was still open. So it's going to be interesting to see how this global crisis really impacts education on multiple levels, and evaluation being one of them.
Yeah. And don't forget that
And Chuck, can I add one other important consideration that's come up? There's this thing now called EdLaw 2D. And EdLaw 2D has to do a great deal with the privacy of data that goes into the technology pieces you use inside of a district. So many of the chief information officers have also had to take on the role of a EdLaw 2D compliance officer, because it can't fall under your tech director. And you have to make sure that these folks are EdLaw 2D compliant. And some of the more popular curriculum resources, data resources, assessment resources are refusing to sign off on New York State's EdLaw 2D kind of Privacy Act, which is a problem, because if they're not compliant, you can't use it. And again, it has to do with where their servers are housed, how much student information they have. In my time in Dunkirk, we had 2 breaches of privacy that the company notified us of. We had to notify every single user, parent, student, even though some of them had long graduated. Cost the district lots of money. We had to bill back the places for it, and that's one of the reasons why everything has to be EdLaw 2D compliant. So you're going to hear that now, because many teachers use free resources that they can add their kids into and the kids can log into, and if they're not EdLaw 2D compliant and they're not aligned with something that's district approved and posted on a website as being approved, they might come and shut you down. And it's not because they're trying to micromanage you. It's because we have all these privacy concerns now that we have to worry about, that this is brought really to the forefront. So just be cognizant of that. And that's a frequent question we have to ask. Are you EdLaw 2D compliant? Are you willing to become so? Because you have to post that up there. I guess my first question to you guys would be, who do you think is in charge of the culture of a school district? Who's responsible for it? I think that's the biggest, the learning piece of it, is that everyone is responsible for that culture. And boy, it is a hard thing to shift. So the superintendent can really try to set that tone. But unless there are layers, unless the district has done a great job of serving their constituency to understand the type of superintendent they want, and unless that superintendent has been 100% open and upfront about who they are, and that is a match, it can be difficult for someone to turn the tide of a ship. So you need to make sure, when we talk about alignment, that you've got that alignment in leadership too, because superintendents will come and go. Chuck, what's the latest research? 4 or 5 years max before they're changing. That the rest of the body is there, right? And it has a long legacy and a long history. And some of you may be experiencing what I know I experienced throughout many of the Erie 2 districts, which is students of the district became teachers of the district, became leaders of the district. And so that culture is so ingrained of how we do things that when you come in and you want to shift things from the outside, it can be difficult because you're seen as someone who's trying to change the status quo. And so a lot of the work that we've done and that I've done in some of the districts has been about, okay, let's take a look at some of those practices. And I think, Chuck, we actually did this in Gowanda with you, which was we had to say, what are some of the practices that Gowanda or any district is known for, and how many of them should be on a museum shelf where we say, what, that was nice. It's a beautiful Mona Lisa, and we should look at it, but it should no longer be driving the culture of what happens. How many of these practices maybe need to go to the repair shop? Maybe it started when you began your teaching career, but here 10 years later, there hasn't been that capacity building. It hasn't been handed down to the new teachers. So the new teachers don't know that that's the way of the district. So we need to go to the repair shop and we need to figure those things out. How many of these things actually need to just go away? That we just agree that they're gone. They're not part of what we do. They don't belong. They don't have a place of tribute on a shelf. And so you have to really start talking about and figuring out what is that culture before you come in and try to change anything. That old saying of you got to sort of get the lay of the land for a year is incredibly true. Listening to everyone. And you're going to find when you come into a new district, there's going to be a lot of people who want to be the first ones at your door, and you should listen. And then you should figure out those people who didn't come anywhere near your door, and you should go seek them out and ask them too, because there's that unwritten culture piece of it that goes there too. So Chuck has up there some common culture build busters, and negativity among staff. I'm sure you guys have experienced this as well. And my experience has been that negativity is typically just the loudest minority that everybody else kind of rolls their eyes at and have been most resistant to change, but they tend to drive everything. And so you have to figure out a way to include them in what you're going to do, as well as include some of those other voices. A lot of that negativity comes from what you see he has there as number 2, that lack of resources. They felt slighted. They maybe haven't gotten it because they're from this department, or they taught this grade level, or they don't really see an incentive to be able to do it. Very often they will claim an unsafe working condition. I work with kids who are too difficult, all you special ed teachers, right? I don't have enough aid support. I need to do restraints every other day. We had a lot of situations like that. And some of it has been that culture of, well, why should I do it? My principal's only going to come in my room one time when he announces it, and I get the same evaluation every single time, no matter what lesson I do. And so paying attention to those culture pieces is so critical, and building the relationship of doing any of this work is so critical. And one of the things that I've been reading lately, just as a recommendation to you, Peter DeWitt is a New York State principal, and he recently came out with an instructional leadership creating practice out of theory book, which really breaks apart instructional leadership to talk about how do you it's again one of those things that we talk about that we know we can sort of say what it is, but we don't have a common understanding of it. But how do you do that? And one of his first pieces is about implementation. How do we implement something and pay attention to the culture that's there? Because if you don't pay attention to the culture as you're implementing it, and you don't listen, and you don't work alongside teachers and other leaders in order to do something, any initiative you do is going to blow up in your face, or it certainly will not outlast you. And that should be your goal, is to build that sustainability so that when you leave that district, that thing is still in place. Well, I guess I have always used this one with folks as we try to do implementation and alignment and working on making sure that everybody's on the same page, because nothing ever happens the way you think it's going to happen. and you can have the greatest vision for it, and you can have planned and planned and planned down to, everything. And it's never going to be that way, because if you're doing it right, you're listening and you're finding out and uncovering things you didn't know. And for a lot of people, that's incredibly frustrating. There is no silver bullet. So you very often take 3 steps forward and 2.5 back, and you have to keep focusing on what you gained and what you learned and being able to pivot. I think the pandemic definitely taught us about pivoting. And I think the true mark of how good our systems are is going to be, what's it going to look like in the fall? What conversations have you already started to have? What impact does this have on your curriculum? And the systems that are solid are going to do well in the fall, and they've already started that work. And the systems that are struggling a little bit are waiting for the governor to tell them what to do. And that's a scary thought, because the bottom line of it is kids are involved, and you don't get a second chance with them. You really don't. So it's hard work. There's nights I cried myself to sleep, but it's rewarding work, because in the end, it's kids. And trust me, those kids will come back and find you when you're waiting on a store somewhere, or washing your car, or you need a lawyer. So they are always going to be there, and they're going to remember the impact you had.